So we're here at Sand Conference 2017 in Italy. So Geoffrey, can you give a brief background on your instrument?
Sure. Yeah. These instruments are classically called Tibetan singing bowls, but in general we call them Himalayan singing bowls as a more accurate name for them, in part because the Tibetan singing bowls implies a connection with the Tibetan Buddhism, and actually, according to scholars like Michener and others, does not seem to have a connection with the Tibetan Buddhism, although there are connections with the pre-Buddhism, the Bon tradition, for example. So in general, it's a Himalayan singing bowls, or it's called Himalayan singing bowl. This is something that relatively recently, entered the Western world. So we can say until the early 1970s, pretty much nobody knew about this in the Occidental world, and around that time, certain Nepali importers began to discover their value. This cultural heritage, began to export them, source them in villages, and then around that time also a record. It's actually considered the first New Age record. It's called Tibetan Bells, was recorded by an American couple, and in that way people in the West first heard about them and began to get interested in them. Just a few more words there. So now we see them popularly used by people in beginning and ending meditations, as part of a mix in sound therapy. It's also called sound healing, using just the singing bowls or mixed with other instruments, and for relaxation effects, healing benefits, and other things we might go into.
How do these differ from traditional instruments, say, of classical music?
It's a really important question. First of all, this particular percussion instrument, you can call it that, and I'll do a demonstration here. With one single tap, you'll notice that the sound goes and goes, and that's quite unusual compared to most instruments that we know. So in the style that they're played then tends to be a more conservative, less dynamic style. Maybe more relevant though is when we speak about what's generally called the harmonic overtones. So in, let's say, normal instruments, or what we think about as instruments, be that guitar, piano, etc., imagine a single piano note or a guitar string. If you were to break that down, it will follow a certain ratio always, and that's called the harmonic overtone series. So within that single guitar string, when you vibrate it, there will be a particular series, and so with the bowls is very unusual in that the bowls don't follow this harmonic overtone series, and that's in part because they're made with hammered bronze, and so you can have there are people, for example, Frank Perry, who published a book, Himalayan Sound Revelations, a few years ago, and there he actually records some of his bowls and using a high-tech app, and in that demonstrated all of the totally random amount of secondary waves, also called partials, which don't fit into this harmonic overtone series. So those are two major differences. A third we can say is what one teacher, Michener of Pennsylvania, he distinguishes the traditional Occidental instruments with instruments like the bowls, but also gongs and nature sounds, etc., with the term ambient mode instruments. And these ambient mode instruments, because of their microtones, because of the partials, they tend to have a therapeutic effect that has not been recorded using the traditional instruments, and that's because of these microtones and partials, it seems.
How might they be used to assist people in attaining states for healing and altered states of consciousness?
Right. Well, there is this is both an art and a science, and that art is something that I continue to learn about. In a certain way, I feel like a beginner, and I imagine that many people in this work feel in that way. Still, there are certain ways that will support that process of healing or entering altered states of consciousness. I do know, for example, speaking simply of people who are absolute beginners, people who take a weekend course, some of these people may not even have music background or alternative therapy background, and that still they sometimes report really amazing things, starting literally as a beginner, and we can call that something of a combination of that the instruments themselves simply are just very effective, even without a real deep understanding of them. And then maybe just a natural sensibility that some of the people have. So it's worth mentioning that there are so many cases, even in the 2-day workshops, where people go, wow, that just felt really amazing, and even reporting states of mind that don't normally happen. That said, we can begin to become a little more sophisticated with the singing bowls. The singing bowls are something like other instruments in general that lend themselves to repeating patterns, for example. And the bowls themselves, and I'm going to tap a bowl one more time, are naturally repeating. There is this wow, 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 wow and that's happening at several levels because of these partials or secondary waves. And when there are repeating patterns, the human being tends to enter this relaxation response, where it's one of the conditions. That was a term which was termed by Herbert Benson of Harvard University, his book, The Relaxation Response, where he demonstrated that the human being has this capacity to enter something in which then the blood pressure normalizes, the heartbeat slows down, and things like that. So the bowl is naturally in that way. You can create repeating patterns, repeating the same 3 bowls again and again, and in that way the mind begins to relax, it begins to trust, and so on. So there's a lot of tricks like that. There is or things that will support those deepening, the listening role of the receiver, or the attentiveness and consciousness of the giver, the acousmatic theory, which refers to not keeping the bowls stable in one place, but kind of moving them around, creating this fascination, adding more texture into the experience, is something to help get beyond the normal thinking mind and then access this deeper part of our being. So those are just a few clues that can help, but there are many more, and maybe will be too much unless you want to go further there.
Now, you gave an hour-long demonstration and concert in the cellar of the castle, Titignano Castle. and where the acoustics were really quite phenomenal.
Yes.
And I noticed as I was laying down and really absorbing the acoustics nature of the singing bowls, that they seemed quite like almost celestial. Now, I play the bansuri, the Indian bamboo flute, and to me that's the sound of nature.
Yes.
And it's very organic. But these singing bowls sort of have a sort of almost an alien quality, and it got me thinking that the materials they're made from do not occur. They're not produced on Earth. They're produced from explosions of supernova,
Yes.
which then form like the core of Earth, but they're not actually produced naturally on Earth.
Yes.
All the heavier elements come from explosions of stars, and therefore it maybe my scientific pedigree got me thinking in that way, but it really took me away from this planet into like the cosmos.
Yes.
Is that something that you feel yourself? Or?
Well, the bowls, they are a unique thing. They are a unique thing, and for sure we need to consider the material that they're made of. And a percussion, a hand-pounded bronze instrument, which is generally 80% copper and 20% tin, does give its unique sound. Is it connected with this mystery or not, or this of metals coming through meteorites outside of coming from beyond the planet Earth? Well, that's really beyond my expertise to really speak about. But for sure, there is something, as you called it, a bit angelic, a bit outer worldly, that is that sense. And I think that is partially that something in the way the partials and the sounds are put together, and even the length of the wave, and so many factors. Yes, there does really seem to be a correspondence. If you watch old kind of 1950s or even beyond that outer space movies, the sound that they use to depict even these spaceships and so on is very similar to singing bowls, and I would not be surprised if even singing bowls were in fact used for in fact, I'll demonstrate here this other movement, because earlier was the percussion. Here is what Frank Perry calls stroking. He was using a different mallet. So yeah, really invokes that out of earth feeling.
So I noticed you had about a dozen bowls the other day, and the higher pitched bowls tend to invoke much more of a heady experience, whereas the bassier were more kind of resonating towards the heart and the gut.
Yes.
Is that the desired intention?
Was not the desired intention in my personal case. Having traveled to a foreign country, I was a little bit limited in what I could bring. So that was partially circumstantial. But at the same time, some people have noticed exactly what you're saying, that the higher tones tend to awaken or activate or vibrate or resonate with the upper parts of our physical body and the energetic centers there, and so on. And yes, it's maybe not coincidental that you didn't mention the lowest part of the being, because this other day I was lacking lower tone bowls, which tend to be heavier and larger, which is one of the reasons I refrained from bringing them. And yes, they do tend to energize people in that way.
The prices seem to vary quite considerably. What could you comment on the difference between a cheap bowl and a top end bowl?
Sure. Well, there is there are newly made bowls, which generally fall into two categories. Something I call machine-made bowls or molded. None of those I have here in Italy, and those you will commonly see in gift shops and so on, partially because they're cheaper to buy and easier to sell in a way. And those, I've seen them ranged in stores from $30 to $90, let's say. And then there are the hammered bronze bowls, newly made, and those are generally sold by weight when they're exported, and then in my personal system I also sell them by weight. So you do sometimes see, I don't know, 7-kilogram bowls, which is a quite large bowl, and then those can even be $1,000 bowls and so on. But of those newly made bowls, simply because they're sold by weight, they fit into that category. And then beyond that, we move into semi-antique or antique bowls. Semi-antique would mean generally less than 100 years, and there's a couple styles. The utabati and kovrevati, and then just sort of general bowls that have been made. Those tend to be priced in a certain way. Some of them are actually becoming rare, like the utabatis, and they tend to be more expensive, especially the very large ones. And then beyond that, you have what I'm calling antique bowls, which, as far as the science tells us, as far as the history tells us, most of them are between 100 and 300 years, although we have a historical noting of bell metal being used from 1608. Certain sellers make claims, or certain bowl players, that they have bowls of even older, like more years. Personally, it is not my domain, so I don't have the capacity to say that that's correct or not correct. But anyway, based on all of that, then we begin to look at the quality of the sound, the popularity of that style of instrument, also because some styles are simply more popular, like the jambati, the supply and demand, so some bowls are just kind of more rare at this historical moment. And then the weight of the bowl tends to be a factor in many cases in Nepal. So a bowl of 1.5 kilograms would generally have more of a value, though it's not a 100% rule, than a 300-gram bowl. And then, maybe I mentioned already, but certain styles. So here in front of me I have a style. The higher pitched one is called mani, and the lower pitched one is called tarobati. And generally, in the case of these two, the manis would be more expensive, partially because of the weight, partially because it's a little bit rare as a style, or a lot rarer actually. And so those are some factors.
Is your singing a traditional accompaniment to singing bowls, or is it something you developed on your own?
Mm-hmm. Yes, well, first of all, I'd just like to speak about traditional with the bowls, because there's a lot of misperceptions there. Most of my information comes from Michnur of number 9ways.org, who was in Nepal in the 1970s, who was like kind of one of the original people, and one of the people who really ran with it and who has done research. So here I'm doing my best to speak from the knowledge that I gathered from him, that as a traditional thing, as far as we know, and I'm sure there's plenty that we don't know, we can say it was a bit more unusual that the bowls were used as sound. Is possible, or is hypothesized that yes, in around the 1970s and even the decades before that, it was really not being used. There have been some hypotheses that it was in larger, greater use as instruments earlier. centuries before. But as far as we know, it seems to have been a secondary use, a specialized use, a shamanic use. Additionally, this idea that people were using like a set of bowls. Now, commercially speaking, there are people who they recommend, for example, 7 bowls. They say, well, you need 7 bowls and 7 notes, and it's connected with the 7 energy centers or chakras. What we know about a traditional use of the bowls, based on what I've just told you, is that that was not a traditional paradigm. Michener would say that people would use a single bowl. They would use the best bowl that they could come across and to create effect. That said, for example, in the certificate course that I took with him, one of our guest teachers was a lama, or Kempo is the title, from the Bon tradition, a tradition that has 18,000 years of written history. And this person who is, this Kempo, who is quite actually important and a lineage holder, says that yes, the bowls were part of the traditional medicine. And he even demonstrated a little bit about that. Thus, from that point of view, the singing is a totally contemporary approach. Though mantras were used, actually even this Kempo said that yes, when he was using mantras, traditional mantras. My singing style is a personal style, has been influenced maybe by the American Indian dancing I did in my late teens, connected in fact with the Boy Scouts of all things. And so there have been influences like that, but is truly a unique style, I would say, of singing.
Where can one find more information
about singing bowls?
Do you have a website?
Yes, in terms of my work, www.theelephantbowl.com. That tends to be mostly in Spanish. We also have that on Facebook, The Elephant Bowl. Geoffrey Torkington, also on Facebook, spelled with like Geoffrey Chaucer with G. In terms of books to read, probably the most accurate, interesting, and comprehensive would be this what I mentioned earlier by Frank Perry. I believe the title is Himalayan Sound Revelations. Frank Perry of England. And it seems that when we speak strictly about singing bowls, there is both a real shortage of research information and also even a shortage of accurate information. So it's one of these areas where there's a lot of, let's say, wishful thinking, but not so much, which is useful and often filled with many inaccuracies.
So we're coming to the end of the interview now. Would you like to perhaps give a demonstration?
Sure. Yes. Maybe I could speak just very briefly about my work, because I think it's kind of unusual in the sense that I've been very focused on opening the door for people. Like that, this is my full-time work and has been centered in Mexico, more recently the United States, and it's been amazing to see. Probably about 1,000 students have come through. Many of them have invested in an instrument or a group of instruments. Many of them have started to use them, and it's just been amazing to witness more or less normal people to gain benefit from these. There are people who are a little more, teachers who are a little bit more restrictive and with their approach, think that you shouldn't put these tools into people's hands so quickly. But it's just been so much heart, so much positive benefit has come from all of this, and that's really the focus of my work. That, and through the sets of bowls that we sell, investing in more bowls, newly made bowls, antique bowls, rare antique bowls, and so on. So that's a little my center of gravity as I'm moving now into the United States. Here I am, having done a presentation in Italy this week. So it's becoming kind of a global movement, and the hope is that some of these other students continue to give courses and so on. I have here only 2 bowls, which I brought, but I will play for a minute or 2 here.
Thank you, Geoffrey, for sharing your knowledge and time.
Thank you, Joshua Bloom.